Well, time for another video, and as we know, the old saying, the good die young. And today, I just want to mention the death of one of the chief figures of the religious right, Dr. James Dobson. I'm sorry, if there was a noise, that was my neck fan, because it's getting about 105 degrees, which probably isn't as hot as where Dr. Dobson may have ended up. I don't know, maybe he did go to heaven. I don't know. But anyway, he died today, or yeah, I guess it was today, at his home in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And he was 89 years old. So he was the same age as my oldest sister. Well, my only sister now. And anyway, he hadn't been much in the news at all. He ran or started Focus on the Family, which allegedly was designed to help families, Christian families, but really what it was is it was a political group wrapped in religious garb so he could get those tax exemptions, I'm assuming. But he founded that in about 45 or so years ago. Well, no, actually 1977, almost 50 years ago. And he really, for all his talk about families and wanting to preserve the family, he was a political animal from the beginning. And he was right up there with Paul Weyrich and some of those others. Well, Weyrich had a lot more influence long-term than Dobson did. But Dobson, I think, was born an only child. And he was raised Nazarene. He was born in Louisiana in 1936. But his dad was quite strict. I think both parents were quite strict. And that kind of, colors your outlook on stuff. And so he was, the dutiful son and all this kind of stuff. But I kind of think that maybe one of the reasons that his books, and many, many people hate his books, that were raised, especially those who were raised on Dobson's books, on child rearing and marriage and stuff. Maybe he was abused himself physically. I don't know. When I would hear about his support for corporal punishment, to say nothing about that famous dachshund that he had, and I think it was The Strong-Willed Child or something, that he wrote that book, and talked about beating up his dog, his little dachshund. Yeah, there's some real issues that he had that I don't think he ever got help for. But Dobson grew up, and he eventually got a doctorate. I think it was the University of Southern California. Why don't I look this shit up? God damn it. Where the hell is it? Anyway, yeah. I don't think, yeah, he was born in Shreveport. This is from his website. And does it say where he was educated? No, it doesn't. So I've got to look that up. But he did go to the USC, I think. And I know he taught pediatrics. But he actually, unlike a lot of these guys that would call themselves doctor, he did have a doctorate. Not an MD, but he had a PhD. And he was a psychologist. And he started out as kind of a counterpoint to but Dr. Benjamin Spock, who was actually an MD, I do believe. Let's look at that. And not a psychologist. Oh, why don't I do this? Why don't I look this shit up? And yeah, he was a pediatrician. So he was an MD. And Dobson was, yeah, he went to Point Loma Nazarene University, and then he went to USC, and he had an MA and a PhD. So he actually was trained as a psychologist. So he was legit that way. And I believe, yeah, he studied academic psychology. But I believe his interest was in special education in the area of autism, I believe. But I could be wrong on that. But I know it was in special education. And anyway, but he taught for years, and let's see what it says. Yeah, he was an associate, because it always said on Focus on the Family when he had his radio program, and I used to listen to it back in the 80s and stuff. They would always talk about his educational background. So he became a clinical professor of pediatrics, and he it says here he was exposed to troubled youth and the counterculture. So, but his shtick was to be a counterpoint to Dr. Benjamin Spock, and he had and so he kind of, in the end, he threw the academics by the wayside. He taught for 14 years at USC, but there was more money to be made in grift. So he wrote books like this, Dare to Discipline and The Strong-Willed Child, and that was a direct response to Dr. Benjamin Spock, who was a little bit more lenient, certainly didn't encourage or believe in assaulting kids, also called corporal punishment. But Dobson was big on that. And so parents that were, mostly they were Christian or evangelical Christian, and they were new parents and they didn't know what in the hell to do with their kids, they looked to Dobson for guidance, and lots and lots of families were damaged by James Dobson. And it was the same with his attitude about marriage. You know, he was all big about the traditional sex roles, that the man went out and earned the living and the woman stayed home, and she was to stay home till all the kids left home, and all this, at least, and all this kind of crap. It was all outdated by the time he even was peddling that. But at least, unlike some, like Webben and these idiots, he actually grew up in the 50s. But he had kind of rose-colored glasses about what it was really like. And he did what most people did back then. He married young. He married his wife, Danae. Or not Danae, that was his daughter. Shirley. Married Shirley, and then he had a daughter, Danae, I think was her name, and adopted a son. And, you know, and he had that mythical family life. But he was big on that. He just absolutely felt that unless women had to work, really was necessary, they should stay home. And all that crap. And so, over the years, since so many of his guests on his radio program, and I'm kind of jumbling around, he did the grift, he made tons of money off those books, and then he had his radio program, and then he started his quote-unquote ministry, Focus on the Family. But so many of his guests on his radio program were women. And, you know, they had careers. Even if they called themselves housewives and all this, or homemakers, they had careers. So he had to be a little bit more subtle about his attitude over the years. And so he had to loosen up just a itty bitty bit, but he was one of these that still believed the man was the leader of the home and the woman was just a wife appliance. But then he got a lot of consternation from people because he was very anti-gay and all that. And so many in the community were a little bit, they weren't grieving, let's put it this way, when they heard Dobson had died. And a lot of people who were influenced by Dobson's child-rearing ideas, they weren't crying a lot of tears over Jim. But his thing was politics. That's really what it was. He had connections to Reagan. He had connections to Bush II. And on into the Trump era. But of course, by the time Trump got in there, Dobson was starting to, you know, he was getting a bunch of miles on him. And eventually, he scaled back on his ministry. And back in 2010, now what the hell happened to him? Let's see. He founded the organization, but he got squeezed out, or no, he stepped down as president. And then he resigned as chairman of the board in February 2009. So he did step down and focus on a family, continued, but Dobson founded the James Dobson Family Institute, and he continued on the radio and podcasting and doing YouTube videos, and I guess we'd call it podcasts, called Dr. James Dobson's Family Talk. And so over probably the past year, he was farming that out, or the past couple of years, farming it out to people like, oh shit, what's his name? Oh God. Oh, I need to shut up. I can't remember who the hell he is. But he'd farmed it out to other people in his organization. And so they were taking over the hosting duties. And once in a while they would put some classic episode where Dobson was still the host. So you knew Dobson was about ready to go on to his reward. And he continued to be political. And he wasn't beyond sensationalism. And I remember this because, again, I listened to him pretty religiously back in the 80s, 1980s. And one time he had an interview with Ted Bundy. And supposedly Ted Bundy was, Ted Bundy was, he was a narcissist. He was a killer beyond beyond dispute, that he killed over 30 women, and maybe significantly more than that. But he had given an interview with Dobson right before he was executed in January of '89, and he was talking about how he got into porn and all this kind of stuff, and it messed with his head, which it does mess with your head. But Bundy was very cagey, and he was still conning even right to the end. So you'd have to find out who was using who. Was Bundy using Dobson, or was Dobson using Bundy? It worked both ways. Of course, Bundy, ended up dead, but Dobson sold tapes of that, of his interview with Bundy, and made a pile of money off of that. And a lot of people got kind of upset with Dobson because he was doing that and making money off of that. But Dobson's was always about the grift. He was always about the grift. And a guy named Gil Mogerly used to be a co-host of his back in the 80s, but he got quote-unquote disgruntled with Dobson, and he wrote a book about him. And I think it was called Dr. James Dobson's War on America, or something to that effect. I have it. I have it in storage. But Dobson was not the easiest person in the world to work for. That's the primary thing that I was struck by it, that he was very difficult. You know, I don't know if you would call him would call him a micromanager or whatever, but he was very difficult. He was not, you know, the folksy character that he was on the television or the radio broadcast. And that was the thing that made Dobson such a dangerous figure, is that he came across as so down to earth, so low key. You know, he wasn't fire and brimstone, wasn't any of that. He could sit there and carry on a conversation with his little southern twang. He could carry that on, and a lot of people bought into what he was selling, trying to sell. Lots of people bought into it. Even the millions of people bought into what he was trying to do. But for him, it was always about the grift and always about political power. So he died, and he gloated over the overturning of Roe v. Wade and all this stuff. And I'm sure he thought the future was his, or his ilk. But you know, Dobson, as bad as he was that way, he's nothing compared to Doug Wilson and that bunch. I mean, they're way beyond Dobson. But Dobson paved the way for people like these extremists that we have now that are infecting the body politic. So Dobson has a lot to answer for putting this kind of division in American life and damaging a lot of people in the process. So anyway, I know I'm rambling on. I'll put this little, it isn't much of an obit. It's just a little blurb about him. And yeah, Family Talk is broadcast all over the country. 1,500 radio outlets. So anyway, yeah, Ryan's his son. So I don't know if Ryan took over on that. Took over the business. Maybe not. So it says here he authored over 70 books. New Dare to Discipline, New Strong-Willed Child, Bringing Up Boys, Bringing Up Girls When God Doesn't Make Sense. And so I don't think those books, I mean, he wrote those books 50 years ago, like Dare to Discipline and Strong-Willed Child. And so this stuff is continuing to pollute the American society. So anyway, as I said, the good die young in this world. It's a shame, you know, and people who aren't so nice seem to go on and on and on. Although Dobson was a little bit younger than some of them. You know, like old Jimmy Swaggart, who we talked about earlier. So all those old guard people are dying off. The old televangelists and similar types. But anyway, that's all I have to say about that.